Good evening, New York, and welcome to the Public Advocate Office and BetaNYC Fireside Chat on Democracy and Access, which is a part of our ongoing initiative and engagement series called the People's Tech Assemblies, where we look to lift up the voice and narratives of New Yorkers and the issues that they're facing here in New York City to better advocate for them and collaboratively come up with the solutions that are going to be equitable and inclusive for New York City moving forward. It's my great honor to introduce our panel, but also our moderator who's going to do all the heavy lifting today. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Noel.
Hello, everybody. My name is Noel or Noel. He, him are my pronouns. I'm the executive director of BetaNYC. And tonight we're having a conversation about democracy, what it is and what we think it should be for the 21st century. As John gave in his introduction, the Office of the Public Advocate and BetaNYC, along with 7 other partners, seek to listen, learn, and develop recommendations on how technology, data, and innovation can improve New York City. Through an ongoing listening process, we are engaging New Yorkers to document their needs and outline collective goals, values, and recommendations. You can access this at Peoples Tech, that's plural, peoplestech.nyc. So, as we are living through this unprecedented era where democracy seems to be under attack from every which way and public trust in our federal government is low, and that there are 5.5 million registered individuals who could vote in New York City, but yet less than 1 million of them voted for the mayor, tonight we want to ask the question, how can New Yorkers come together to model a truly inclusive democracy? Our guests are the Public Advocate Jumaane Williams, who's running a little bit late, and then Keesha Gaskins-Nathan, the Director of Democratic Practice from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and Jamela from the Manhattan Borough from the Public Advocate's Office. Can we have the two of you give an introduction?
Sure. Thanks so much, Noel. It's great to be here with you, Jamila, and we're super excited when Jumaane gets here as well. My name is Keesha Gaskins-Nathan. I direct the Democratic Practice Program for the United States here at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. I also direct the Racial Justice Initiative here. What that means is I have the honor of directing grant making nationally, but we also at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, as our home jurisdiction, have a particular interest in the democratic practice here in New York City. And so we also work with many, many organizations, including BetaNYC, as part of our democratic infrastructure here in the city. My personal background is as a voting rights attorney. I also teach political science courses at Columbia University in the SEPA program, and I'm a poll worker. So I'm actually really excited to be here and feel I'm a big part of the civic life of the city of New York. Thanks so much. Jamila?
Thank you so much, Keesha, and hi, Noel. I'm Jamela Rose. I'm the Deputy Public Advocate of Civic and Community Empowerment here at the Office of the New York City Public Advocate. Before I even go into further details, I do apologize on behalf of the Public Advocate, who will be with us shortly. My role here at the Public Advocate's Office is largely to look at voting infrastructure, voting rights, governmental operations, and other forms of democracy across our city, and how do we create pathways that are more equitable for all residents and not just some. Also, I focus on immigrant justice and also Black maternal and Black reproductive health. So I'm really excited to be here this evening, just to answer a couple of questions before we turn it over into the meat of the program. And I'll hand it back over to you.
Well, I think we are at the main course here. So it's great to be with both of you on this wonderful digital stage. So first, democracy. Let's try to frame this weird word that we throw around quite frequently. to many, democracy is an act executed through a variety of actions. And like most people know democracy when they go into the poll site and either nominate someone to run for for the general election, or they actually vote for them to represent them for some set of terms. But, for me, in my work, looking at how kind of technology and data and design practices like empower government, to me, democracy is actually a practice. It's like a muscle flexed every day by millions of people who engage in a variety of activities, from attending community board meetings, informing themselves about what's happening within a community, filing a 311 service request, organizing neighbors to ask for better services, possibly even running for office, or providing feedback on how services are run. Like, all of these are activities or acts of democracy. I would love for both of you to take an opportunity to tell us how you define democracy, either in your role professionally or personally, as you are members of this democratic society.
So I'd like it. So as we think about this, I'm going to frame this in terms of how we do our work here at the RBF. And the first thing I want to point out is we don't have a democracy program. We have a democratic practice program. And that really looks at our democratic systems. How do things work? Things like ranked choice voting, how do people show up at the polls? What's our election administration practices? And all these other pieces, plus our democratic culture. And how the democratic culture comes together to meet our democratic systems is our democratic practice. How do we as New Yorkers practice democracy, as you really already referred to, Noel? And really thinking about not just what are the mechanisms, not just showing up on quote unquote election day and primary day and all these other issues that happen, but really saying how do people engage around the issues that affect them most, and understanding how to intervene in ways that impact the lived experiences of people's lives.
Great. Jamela?
Yeah, and I think similar to what both of you have already said, when we think about democracy, a lot of times people tend to focus on registering people to vote or getting people to the polls. And like, that's a part of it. Like, the voting portion of democracy is the foundation of it. But also, if we're really looking at democracy and democratic participation and practice, we have to look at all the different ways that we collect voices from those who are the most marginalized. And how do we take those voices? How do we synthesize that information, that data, analyze it, and then use it to then create legislation, policy, and practices that then increase equity in our city? And so democracy can be attending a community board meeting, like was said before. It could be also participating in a protest. It could be something as simple as making a 311 complaint and calling and saying sanitation was not picked up or the catch basin is overflowing. It's like those are all parts of ways that collectively we contribute towards democracy to make our cities safer, to make our cities run more efficiently, and also just to make sure that we have more equitable legislation and policy.
Great,
yeah, I think, you. No, to piggyback on that, people often say they're not political, right? And in the very next breath, they're going down to advocate for their kid at school, or they're saying something to the manager at their grocery store, this, that, and the other. All of these things are acts of democracy, voice, elevating your voice to stand up for yourself, your family, your community. And when we talk about voting, that is a mechanism by which we translate that into the ballot and to elect leaders. But that is only a very small portion of what our entire democratic practice, how people engage, and helping folks really, really see that the act of saying, I matter, my community matters, my family matters, is all a thread within being both a political actor with not just a political actor exercising your power in the community and recognizing how you can flex that power. We care about power a lot at the RBF, so you'll hear me bring that up. But really saying, what does that mean and how do we engage around that?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about the public advocate's role is that in our city charter, which was deemed unconstitutional back in 1989, and there was a savvy group of New Yorkers who saw an opportunity to reorganize city government and to put literally an advocacy individual inside of City Hall, well, right next to it, but still has the powers inside of City Hall. And so I think it's very interesting to look at what the charter says about the public advocate. Jamela, do you want to give a brief introduction of what the public advocate does? Like, what's the charter responsibilities?
Yeah, I can go into a little bit of that. We do much more, but yes. So one of the major things, one of the major functions of our office, of course, is to be an ombudsman to the city of New York. So we're the mediator. We're between the residents of the city of New York and the government of the city of New York. So we have a whole constituent services team that's just there to hear complaints and to help people process information. We're also there to legislate. We're not the city council, but we do preside over the city council, and we can create, draft and introduce bills into law. And we do that. Actually, the public advocate has more pieces of legislation than all previous former public advocates combined. So we do that quite well. And then also we have an advocacy arm of our office. And so we, in this particular iteration of this public advocate of New York City, we work very, very closely with activists and advocates and with grassroots community-based organizations, because the public advocate himself, comes from the grassroots. And so we feel like when those solutions are created at a grassroots level and we're hearing what people have to say, those who are most impacted, those who are most marginalized, those who've been silenced, who've been historically disenfranchised, if we're hearing what they have to say and then we're taking that information in and we're creating policies and legislation based on it, then we can actually move the city forward. So we do a lot of that. We actually submit reports to the city of New York and a few other things as well that are less sexy to talk about on this call right here. But all of it helps us move forward. We're also charter cops. So we're also the agency that has to actually be a watchdog. That's what we get to do. We get to look at what the agencies are doing. If they're not communicating, if they're not interfacing with the public correctly, if they're not providing enough information for the public, we step in as that watchdog and we're able to then make some noise, and the public advocate does that well.
I mean, it's really an amazing, when I think about the charter being the constitution of the city, I think it's an amazing position for us to have, right? It's a very unique set of powers that can really shape our democracy and hold government accountable from being within government. Since I landed in New York City, I've been engaged with the public advocate's office one way or another, trying to get people in as the public advocate, arguing with public advocates, fighting with public advocates. So it's been I really enjoy the role of the public advocate, and I'm going to keep on saying that several times over. And I would love to bring in Keesha in regards to, so you're a funder, you're part of Philanthropy. So, why is Philanthropy involved, and why is Philanthropy passionate about democracy?
We are passionate about philanthropy. So philanthropy sits within civil society, right? So we are not government, nor are we like the market, the business market, right? Philanthropy exists in a place to support civil society organizations, neighborhood groups, community advocates to support that work. As people define the challenges for themselves, they solve their problems. That as we look at communities as not as, vulnerable targets, but as intelligent collectives that understand the problems that they have to face, can define their own solutions. And how do we help support by funding organizations that work in and with community to advance their goals? And we recognize that we can't have a functioning democracy without a strong civil society. That includes reporting, that includes data information, that includes public agencies. It includes all kinds of spaces where we can work either in partnership or directly as funders. And we just see that as a huge and important part. And there's some folks who come at it through very specific ways. You'll see a lot of philanthropy funding housing or other advocacy groups that are issue specific. But we have chosen our intervention here at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund to be around democratic systems, structures, and democratic culture.
And just to stick with you for one follow-up on this, I mean, I love your background. I can't imagine, you seem to be literally plucked from the heavens to be brought here to New York City when it talks about your role.
Minneapolis, actually, but that's close.
I hear they have a lot of good bike lanes over there and a lot of
They
great
do.
bike infrastructure. But your history of being with the League of Women Voters and then following up by being at the Brennan Center, how has your history of being an advocate helped your role within philanthropy? I mean, you started off by talking about that you were also a poll watcher. So, how is your lived experience? I mean, you're also a trial attorney, right? A civil trial attorney. So
I don't practice right now, but yes.
how living all of these lives and walking through these different worlds, how has that helped kind of better frame your understanding of what democracy should be and how the Rockefeller Brothers Fund should be funding or supporting different types of democratic practices?
Sure. The organizations I've worked with have really advocated for democracy for democracy's sake. The idea and notion that our systems and processes must work for everyone. And that is deeply challenged in our current systems. One of the things we often think about is, are the systems that were designed hundreds of years ago adequate to the task of fully integrating and thinking about and being fully measurably inclusive for all folks as we sit here today? Are we leveraging our digital opportunities? Are we leveraging the systems that are necessary? Are our oversight institutions a little bit antiquated? And how do we think about those things? My work as a voting rights attorney, working both with technical assistance, with election administration, and also literally suing places and suing people along with my colleagues at the Brennan Center to actually ensure and protect rights at the ballot, have been a big part of that history to understand how rights are, the importance and how hard it is to maintain and protect rights. The League of Women Voters, an incredibly important organization among many that work to inform community, that help people understand. I know when I first moved to New York, I turned to the League and was like, will somebody please explain to me why there's city council and borough presidents and a public advocate, and what are all these layers of government? What do they do? And by the way, what's this community board thing? How do these all fit together to actually govern, and what does that mean? And I will correct you. While I have been known to be a poll watcher in other jurisdictions, actually in New York City, I am a poll worker. I am one of those people that help you figure out, like, if you're in the wrong polling location, how do we do it? We get that ballot and get it out the door. And these are long days, and there's a lot of people who've been doing it a lot longer than I have. But it's also, to me, very important to see that work on the ground. It is very difficult to look at a report or just to kind of do these things and be like, I'm going to sit here in my little office and be like, this is how we're going to help improve things. We have to get out. We have to be in the people. We have to be a part of the systems. We have to see what's going on. And from those vantage points, we can help work with advocates like the city advocate, like borough presidents and others who are really working hard to create the kind of New York that we want to see, and that ability for us to engage effectively as partners. And as you noted, Noel, sometimes as opponents, but that's the big part of accountability, and that's a big part of the work. So that's been my experience, and how each of these things helped me come to a place where we've been able to leverage resources to really continue to improve democracy in the United States here and in New York City.
Thank you. I want to recognize the public advocate for coming in. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Thank you for all the great work that you do and the fight that you were just at, making sure that the unions have proper representation. So we're talking about democracy. We're talking about kind of like, what does democracy look like? Would you like to introduce yourself real quickly and just frankly say, what does democracy mean to you?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Peace and blessings, love and light. And thank you, Noel and BetaNYC, just for the work you've been doing and joining with the office. Thank you, Keesha, for taking some time out. And I saw Jamela, who was on here, filling in a little bit. I appreciate that. Sorry about being late. I just want to shout out my team, John Cadden and all the data tech team, for just the amazing work they've been doing with this office and really broadening what we get involved with and pushing in just amazing ways. So I just want to thank him, them, you, and everybody who's looking. I think the most important thing when talking about democracy is making sure that folks, we hear this, but it's true. It's not a spectator sport. And so sometimes, and it's probably been said, you cast a ballot and then you walk away. And that's really not the way we can make the change that we need. It's really staying on top of folks and being involved. I heard Keesha speaking about community boards, precinct council board, but understanding what that is and the impact. And sometimes we have trouble just getting folks to come out and vote if it's not a presidential election. And so that's one issue in of itself. But after that, you pull the lever and think it's over. And that's not it. So democracy is really understanding that, people will say, I'm not involved in politics, but you are. From the moment you wake up to the moment you come home, everything you do is all about politics. And so it's really just about staying involved, taking advantage of the vote. But in between that time, holding folks accountable, understanding it's not ever going to be just up to me. It wasn't just up to Obama. It was up to us to hold him and others accountable. And we didn't do that, I don't think. And we don't very often.
You launched right into a question that I was saving for later, but since we're halfway through this and here you are, I'm going to be very frank and just ask, how should we hold government accountable?
It's very important to hold government accountable, one, by voting. So you should very much come out and vote. And I can tell you, for being in the rooms where people aren't, we should hold people accountable by coming out and vote. Very often, the louder the vote, the more people pay attention. But in between time, people should really find ways to engage with their elected official. As was mentioned, I don't think people even understand the community boards, understand the precinct council boards. And so when I was a council member, people would say, I would never see you. And then I would say, well, where did you want to see me? Because I had at that point about 160,000 constituents. I said, if I shook 130,000 hands personally, there'd be 30,000 people who say they never saw me. So I do have a role to play to make sure I'm getting the information out. But if you're not going to the places where we're going to be all the time, sometimes you have to do that as well and hold yourself accountable. And all of us, however, have a role to play, including the Office of the Public Advocate, and making sure we get better mechanisms to communicate with people. So it is a two-way street. Making sure we're here talking about data, making sure data is really accessible, making sure that commissions are not meeting at times when people are at work, trying to figure out a way for government not to have meetings while people are at work, and have a way for people to come online. And so there's different things that we have to do, but really it's intentionality. And sometimes that intention is not there. And part of that might be because there hasn't been much repercussion for not making the intentionality there. So it's something that we have to hold folks accountable, including myself, for.
Well, to hold you accountable, I'm looking forward to your first COPIC meeting. I'm just going to put that out there.
Yes.
Sir, it's really important that we have COPIC. COPIC is the Commission on Public Information and Communication. It's one of the ways that we hold Do It and 311 and a bunch of different websites accountable. So
no, you're correct, and thank you for bringing up COPIC. I was gonna bring it up myself, but you're 100% right. And John Catt is one of the biggest COPIC pushers in the office, and so we're really trying to find a way to make that happen. And you yourself have been really big on that, so I appreciate it. We got to make it happen.
So just to follow up on this line, you have, you appoint people to commissions, right, that are citywide, that have a mixture of, that are appointed by, sometimes the mayor, sometimes we're a president. What is that role within the public advocate of appointing people to these various commissions? How do you help ensure that those commissions are meeting and that they're holding government accountable? Particularly with a type of government or a mayor that seemingly doesn't want to be held accountable for regardless of their actions.
Well, it's interesting. I look at this a little different than people might think, whether it's CCRB or the City Planning Commission. So there was a gentleman by the name of Lou Fiddler, may he rest in peace. He vetted me. He made sure I had the right credentials, and he put me on the community board. And after that, he never asked me to vote anyway, right, even as we disagreed on many, many things. And I always respected that. And so I kind of follow that model. I try to vet people who I think will uphold government the way I think government should be upheld. And we make sure that they have the kind of vision that we have for government. and we make sure there's diverse voices in government, because often there isn't. And then we try to find that diversity and match it with the committees and commissions that we have. And then what we really do is check in from time to time, make sure that things are going right. Is the support that we can do? Is the things that we should know about? But I actually generally don't say, vote this way, vote that way. But if there's egregious things happening, then we have to figure out whether somebody gets reappointed. But I think we've done a good job, for the most part, of making sure people's visions align, and then they just have a job to do after that.
Great, thank you. Keesha, in our preparation, some of the conversations that we had were around three questions. One is how should we hold government accountable? Who should we be measuring, or how should we be measuring the services that government is providing? And then who should we actually attempt to serve? In your role at RBF, how do you look at measuring an organization's ability to make democracy better? How do you
Sure.
help them set up those goals?
So one of the big things with philanthropy is we are well in a position to provide resources. We are not in a position to define the work in that specific kind of way. When we look at organizations, we look at their mission, then we look at their goals. And we also say, look, what are your benchmarks for success? How are you defining what it is that you're seeking to do based on the mission of your organization? And how are you able to meet those metrics? And those things become important. We're talking on an individual to individual level. But of course, I think, Noel, you're talking about something that's a little bit broader. It's how do we think about impact on a broader scale with our democracy? How do people feel heard? How do people talk about these spaces? And I think Public Advocate Williams touched on some really important things about how we communicate out this, that, and the other. One of the things that we feel is super important is not just how do we define what people need to hear, but how do we listen? And making sure our technology has feedback loops so people can not just hear what elected officials have to say, but elected officials can hear what people have to say and have the opportunity to be heard. This is a huge city with an enormous number of constituents, and the ability for those constituents to be heard means that we have to set up mechanisms to do so. And recognizing that leadership by listening is just as important as leadership by talking. And how do we support mechanisms, organizations, and people trying to be a part of that informally and formally? How do we help people understand that community boards, it's great if you know somebody to be appointed, but there's also public seats on community boards. And there's other ways to get on, to have access, to hold accountable, that are more direct to the people. And that's not always clear and obvious in a city like New York that has a lot of structures, a lot of systems that feel very, very complicated to people. But I do think that there has been, great strides. Some of the amazing reports put out by the Public Advocate's Office, including the zoning report to address racial disparity, to look at all these things that really look at how do these public offices actually impact the day-to-day life, and then present opportunities for the intervention for the public. And so for us, our role says those things have to be distilled. There's a lot of organizations like BetaNYC, like Legal Women Voters, like others that take information from the public sphere, distill it, put it into a form that those folks can use it to hold government accountable. And we think it's very important to make sure that that infrastructure in our civil society is healthy, is robust, and is able to support that kind of work. And that's everything from organizing groups and direct activism. I'm sure Public Advocate Williams wants to see people standing up, holding himself accountable, just like he wants to stand and hold other levels of government accountable. And how do we do that? And what is that push, pull, and flow? Because ultimately what it boils down to for us is, what is the impact on the lived experiences of people's lives? If indeed these systems and processes do not yield meaningful opportunities to be responsive, in connection with people using formal systems like voting, then we have to continue to think. We have to continue to iterate together. We have to continue to innovate together to be responsive to where we are today. So we see less than 1 million people showing up to vote for one of the most powerful offices in the state of New York, certainly in the city of New York, when there are 5.5 million eligible voters. What does that look like? What does it mean? And how do we help people understand the relevance of that activity to their rent, to their jobs, to the schools, all the things, to garbage pickup, all the things that are about the quality of life. And so that's how we sort of see like how we talk about measurement. And it's a tough thing because it does get entangled with spaces that we're not allowed to function in. We cannot electioneer, we cannot support candidates. And so we really do have to think about how we support people and how we enable people to be more effective in the space.
That speaks a lot about co-creation, right? Like it's like figuring out how do we build systems that enable policymakers and neighbors to come together and have a conversation, ideally not argue like at a community board meeting, but like actually get to the substance of the issue and then kind of meditate and then move and then be able to put that policy into action or possibly even experiment. Do either of you two have examples of kind of like prototypes where democracy kind of was taken from the neighborhood door-to-door level that then was able to move forward and be able to scale? Do you have examples of nonprofits or specific campaigns that started local that were then able to experiment, get people's feedback, and then grow?
For me, most of what I've done for my entire electoral career has been a co-creation of policy and a co-creation of government. And it's what's been able to, even fuel success. And I always try to point out because, the status quo way of doing things in politics isn't usually co-creation. It's other ways that I think are actually harmful, and people kind of see, being on the street or being quote unquote activist as a pathway that doesn't work. And I think we've been able to show that it actually does. And we've been able to do much more than people thought simply by the power of having the folks behind you. And the best example I had for a while was the Community Safety Act, when we dealt with the abuses of stop, question, and frisk, when there was legislation brought to us by Communities United for Police Reform that had been worked on by their members. We managed to do that at a very difficult time, and we managed to override a mayoral veto. But even as I'm doing now, working on the Black maternal health package, it came from community. It also came from making sure I had a diverse team of people, because I'm not sure that package would have been as prioritized as it is if I hadn't had the diversity that we had in our team. Lo and behold, it actually has been more personal to me than I thought it would be, even when we started introducing it. But if you look at the work that we're doing for transgender non-conforming New Yorkers, again, having diversity of people on the team are important. The racial impact study came directly for Churches United for Fair Housing and their member organization. So staying close to the ground is really important. We actually redesigned the Public Advocate's office to actually be more, the previous public advocate was an attorney, and she had a very focused mind on litigation. As a community organizer, I came in with that mindset. And so the largest part of our office is community engagement. So we're able to hear directly from folks, and people are able to hear directly from us. And that's what I actually believe co-governance should be, and what government should be. A lot of times folks get elected and think that it's really just about them. And that's unfortunate. We've had so much measured success, and I'm hoping people understand that model. We have a model similar when it comes to public safety and gun violence that has also been tremendously successful and got us to where we were in 2018, 2019, which is the numbers that people compared to. And if we're not careful, we'll get away from that as we're seeing the spike in violence going on now. But the co-creation of government and public safety is a really important conversation to have.
Keesha, would you like to take that question as well?
I can't imagine being able to add on. I think those are really great examples of how things move from a notion in the street to actually what it takes to mandate. And I think what's actually incredibly important here is the partnership level. I think the Public Advocate's Office demonstrates something that we believe in very deeply, which is the partnership between civil society and electeds. What does it mean to take ideas that are born and then have elected officials that are able to carry that forward? Notions of not just public policy, but fiscal policy. How does it just happen, right? For us, one of the things we like to do is we like to support innovation and ideas. But to support these ideas, we have to know that there's a pathway, that there are elected officials that are going to say, hey, look, if this pilot works, let's carry it forward. And if it shows up someplace, we're going to be able to carry it forward. Oh, and there's a budgetary model that actually supports it. It's not just a notion of an interesting idea, but actually a way to say we can take this from proof of concept to real life. And those things are few and far between. They're hard to do. And I think that an orientation around community advocacy and activism, I think, does bring, a certain lens to the table. And I say that as an attorney who does believe in suing people to get them to do the right thing at times, but recognizing that all of this is part of a really important network and system of strategies that are effective. And so I was about to say I had nothing to add, but then I added, didn't I?
I just want to add, and I appreciate that. And litigation is important, so we need all the tools. But one of the things that you mentioned, with the pilot program, the way we got to where we are now with our cure violence model and the mayor's office of gun violence prevention actually came from a pilot of a task force I chaired. There was a fiscal impact. We went from about 5 million to about over 40 million right now, and there's another pilot we're trying to overlay over that. So I'm a big supporter of pilots. Unfortunately, many times what happens is it becomes pet projects of elected officials. There's no intense evaluation, which is really important to be able to evaluate and make things evidence-based and then expand it. And so those are models that I think are very helpful and unfortunately are much fewer and far between than I think people actually realize. And when you talk about data and the use of data, having a user-friendly space when it comes to the city budget is also important. There just really isn't one. And, COPIC can be part of that, but there are other places where we can actually be more user-friendly. The budget is probably the most important thing that definitely the city council does, but government does in general. And it's the thing people understand the least. And a lot of these conversations happen when people are at work in lingo that people don't understand. We had a bill that we passed when the city council that actually made, for the first time, many of the funding that happen to community groups go online. But that in and of itself sometimes is difficult to navigate. I often think government tries its best not to make it as easy as possible to confuse folks. But it's our job who really believe in this stuff to push government, including myself and folks who get in here, to make that thing more accessible. I think if folks really understood the budget, it'll be so much more powerful for the things many people believe in and think are being funded and think are being structured, but really aren't in the way they think they are.
Yeah. And I think that's been a big part of some of the advocates that we funded and worked with, whether it's We Act, ACRE, BetaNYC, who have really recognized the importance of understanding where the funding flows, where the funding disappears, what happens when it's originally allocated, and then when it comes down the pike, like what happened to that? We're going to be facing trillions of dollars coming from the federal government that can be directed to local activities. It is going to be incredibly important that New Yorkers really have a strong sense of where that money potentially can go. What are the programs that are being funded? How do those look like? How do they show up? And how they work in different ways, everything from cooperatives to data opportunities. All this is part of this infrastructure bill, and the ability to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, city level or even state level politicians, this has to flow to communities. This has to show up in a way that's meaningful for people most impacted. And the ability to be able to speak to the relationship between state, federal budgets is really a huge part of the funding structure and the infrastructure that we fund.
Keesha, that was the first hard question that you asked me was in our very first meeting was, what are you doing to make the city budget more accessible and transparent? And how are you helping And that is a question that is seared in my head. And every single week I think about what exactly are we doing to make these budgetary numbers more transparent. And I'm really, really excited that on January 1, Public Advocate Williams will have an ally in that the comptroller, Comptroller-elect Brad Lander, is also very interested in making the city budget machine readable in a way that will hopefully help us make it more accessible, and we can make tools to demystify how our city prioritizes its policy through its budget, which is really, really opaque. Um, Speaking
And the
about
budget is a moral document. It's not just a set of
absolutely,
numbers. It is not just, it is a moral and equitable document. And one of the ways we know that systems are immoral, in my reading, is asymmetry of information. When information is held in one place and denied in another, that to me is at first blush, I said, there's something wrong here. There's something wrong. And the idea of saying, how do we engage in around symmetry of information? Data is is the civil rights landscape for the 21st century. And making sure that people truly understand what needs to happen, I think, is incredibly important. And we're really thrilled to have advocates like Advocate Jumaane really being excited and centering in on some of these questions.
well, I look at the myriad of tools that were launched in kind of emergency measures, whether it was food access tools, or it was the COVID testing sites, or it was the vaccine finder. And to see that like all of these tools were stood up really, really rapidly, but then never user tested for people who have sight limitations, who don't use English as their primary language. I mean, it's painful because I look at the contracts and I see millions of dollars. And I see millions of dollars to build tools that are inaccessible to some of the most vulnerable New Yorkers. And then they've result to having to call 311. And then in 311, we've seen this explosive growth in calls to 311 where the hold time is minutes long. And so it's heartbreaking knowing that in the 21st century, we have the tools and we have the capability, if you're willing to work with the constituents, to make these things work better.
What was even more frustrating during particularly those early days of getting vaccines and trying to figure it out, it wasn't even government that had the best websites to be able to do that. It was a community that came together and really started pushing that information out, really showing the failure of government, which is one. And then two, sometimes a government tries to purposefully obfuscate the data. We found that when we're trying to figure out who was getting tested and who was getting vaccine, it took a while to get that information. And as we thought it was the same communities that usually have less access to the data and usually being hit harder, that were getting tested less and getting vaccinated less, and actually we're having less opportunity to get those things. And so even from dealing way back when with the abuses of stop, question, and frisk, the only reason we were able to do that is because someone passed a law that actually made them have to document how many stops were there. Without that data, we wouldn't have been able to address it. Without the data of who was getting tested and who wasn't, we wouldn't have been able to point things in the right direction. And so it just shows the incredible power that data actually has on public discourse, but also on public policy. And very often, community groups step in where government fails, which is unfortunate, but it's a double edge because we should be funding more of those groups actually to fill the gap.
So I would love to just chime in here a little bit, and I'm going to pick up on a word you used, Noel, vulnerable, and relate that, I think, to what Public Advocate Williams is saying. One of my least favorite words is vulnerable. A lot of, particularly in terms of communities. To my mind's eye, vulnerability is an infantilizing term. It's often used around children. Children are vulnerable. But the idea of saying communities are vulnerable, communities are not vulnerable. Communities are, as collectives, understand the challenges, know how to solve their problems. If asked, they can tell you what they need. What communities are targeted. They're targeted for over-policing. They're targeted for underfunding. They're targeted for undereducation. And it's the data that helps us tell that story. It's the data that helps us say, and And that's incredibly important because the solutions change. If I'm trying to solve a problem for a targeted community, the solutions are deeply different than if I'm trying to solve problems for someone who's vulnerable and needs to be taken care of. It's something else to be able to say, how do we solve problems for communities that are targeted? We can show it with data, we can lift it up, and we can take that information and say, this is what needs to change about actions, about places, and it's about outcomes, and it's about specificity, and it's not generalized notions of like protecting people from themselves or outside spaces. And so I think that is one reason why the data is so important, and it is about reframing from notions of vulnerability of collectives to what it means to have an otherwise healthy, intelligent, thriving community of Black and Brown folks, of folks with disabilities, of other folks within our communities that are not vulnerable, who know what they need. And if we're able to ask them, if we're able to use technology and other systems to listen, if we're able to use the data to measure the impacts upon these communities, we can solve the problems that are actually happening and just not notions of discourse that have been worn into our brains through years and years of politicking.
And we tend to listen to communities when we want to. And so something that was mentioned is a great example of that, public safety. And we have an increase in gun violence that's undeniable. It's happening around the country. So we have to really address that. How we address that is really important. We've done a lot of work around this, but very often in defense of over-policing, what people will say is, well, the communities are asking for more police. And very often that is a true statement. One, we've been trained to think that's the only thing that could respond in some cases. But more accurately, I often say that is true, but they've also asked for the other things they need because they know what they need. We just haven't listened to them. So they've also asked for safe, affordable housing. They've asked for better food options. They asked for better access to healthcare, mental health services. They asked for better education facilities. And for some reason, we don't hear them on that. And the same money we spend on the police department, we won't spend on other agencies. And then we talk about what the communities need. And so we tend to listen to certain things and not others when it suits us.
Thank you for both of those very important comments on this. I'm reflecting on something that happened last week at Cornell Tech. In the conversations that we were having about community, it was a recognition that we're not dealing in the work that we do around digital literacy, BetaNYC, digital and data literacy. There's not one community. There are communities, right? Like there are a variety of communities. There's not a monolithic community, and every single community has its own digital divide. It has its own data divide. It has its own set of issues that need to be worked with to ideally position them into a place of power and respect at the same table, that they're getting the resources that other privileged communities have gotten in the past. And so, Keesha, in our preparations, you brought up something that I do want to try to touch on before this conversation ends, which is that when we talk about data, that we want to build data-informed societies. We want to leverage data and be informed so that way we're speaking from an authoritative truth because, we have these numbers that tell us these things. But as you pointed out, like some of these data sets are inaccurate, and we're dealing with a really big national data set that has some fuzzy numbers attached to it. What should we be thinking about in the next few years and possibly work with for the next decade around data sets that are not as accurate as they should be or could be, particularly the census data? And then Jumaane, I would love to know, how do we build community data sets that are informed from the public and that are not necessarily the purely authoritative things that are in the open data portal?
Yeah, I think as we think about data, I think you've named something that's really important. There's some real questions about how this census turned out, how people were able to engage, so much confusion with the prior White House administration. And it really did impact how numbers were counted and how many people disappeared. And the question, and these are essential numbers, right? This is how we do budget production. projections. This is how we know if there's a FEMA crisis, how many trailers are going to send, how people are helped, because this is the number of people we think are here. And when these numbers are really, really off, they're really, really damaging. And so it's our hope that both government and civil society will start to think about what are the alternative data sets that exist at the municipal and state levels that can either backfill or redefine, recognizing that we frequently use school registration data. And we know from recent interviews, this New York City public schools still don't even know how many students there are in school yet, let alone being able to use this as a backup data set, which is frequently used because of the impacts of the pandemic and the lockdown and how that has affected New Yorkers. So there's really a lot of open questions, while at the same time, the Department of Commerce right now is in conversations with its Frames program to talk about what are those alternative data sets at the federal and state level that they're going to start to use and start to think about, possibly to even backfill official census numbers starting in 2030. These conversations are happening now. And the ability to have those conversations, to intervene on those conversations, and for cities like New York that are deeply dependent on accurate census counts to be able to stand up and say, this is what we need to do, this is what we need to see. In addition to just being engaging in our complete count committees to get people counted, to actually say not everyone's going to be counted, but there are databases, there are participatory, there are systems and processes that people participate in that really help us inform how many people there really are and who's using what, where, and when in the city.
You know, it's interesting. I always love this example of people and organizations who are putting together youth events, who putting together youth forums and programming, but have no young people at the table designing those things. And so we see those things that happen a lot when people are doing things for communities, but don't have the community themselves involved in the planning stages of it. And so too often people are working off false data, and they're also designing ways to get that information from communities without the community members who are really on the ground to tell you what to do. And so you may go to, you know, some of the top level, quote unquote, spokespeople of those communities. You may even go to the elected official. But what you really need to do is be speaking to people on the ground who understand what's happening. You also have to do it with empathy for those communities. And so as angry as I was and still am about people not filling out the census, having to communicate that understanding that Black and brown communities, usually when government is knocking on their door and asking for information, it's not a good thing. And so you have to talk to them with that empathy and probably not show up looking like you're government trying to get information. And we knew that from early on, but didn't get the funding to the community groups who actually can get in there and have the sensitivities to get the information. And so we really have to work on that a lot sooner. When we did a remarkable job, those communities did. And it was frustrating because the vaccine hesitancy was with the same communities. And I was pushing both the governor and the mayor to reactivate that same network of people, and yet they refused. And they tried all these other measures. And I'm like, you have people who have shown you they can get into these communities and you still won't activate them. And so we have to do a better job meeting communities where they are and engaging with them where they are, because trying to engage with them where you want them to be doesn't work, especially where you want them to be. You understand why they're not there, the historic reasons, the historic disinvestment, and take the time. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's something that we have to do. And it just takes the willingness and intentionality to get that done.
Thank you. With the few minutes that were remaining, this is the pie in the sky magic wand question. We know that the next city council is going to be historic. It's going to be one of the most diverse legislative bodies in America, and it's going to be the first female majority city council that the city has ever seen. Yes, absolutely. I'm super excited to see what this city council does. And it's a really unique one because they've got 2 years to prove their case. Then they got to fight again for 2 years, and then they can run again for a full 4-year term. So with this kind of like challenge that the council will face with a really strong mayor and essentially a council term that might be divided in two. What are your hopes and aspirations with the most diverse city council that we've ever seen and the first female-led majority city council?
My hopes and aspirations is that a female-led council governs the way women govern. And we know that women govern differently. We know that women have a tendency to listen better, that regardless of partisan orientation, women are more focused on housing, more focused on education, that we know that there does tend to be better and more effective legislation that comes out of female-led bodies. And I'm really, really hoping and believing in the New York City Council to prove that case. That's what the voters wanted. That's what the voters voted for. And the ability to be able to say, we are going to listen, and we're going to listen in different kinds of ways, that we're going to reject some of these patriarchal models. We're going to say, what does it stand up? We're going to value the feminine, both in workplaces and outside of workplaces. And we're going to stand up and say, this is what matters for New York.
Ditto to all of that. And having been inside there, I'm excited to see what's going to happen with this new group. I think we haven't seen this kind of energy since 2009, when a group of folks who benefited from term limits and public financing came in and really did a number there, and it actually benefited the city in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, I think too often as you're in there, you come in with the great ideas, you start getting into the same bad habits of how people make decisions in those spaces, which is, the argument for term limits to begin with, to get some new ideas in there. One thing I'm hoping folks begin to realize, which is what I try to do. One is the seat you're holding is now more important than the people you're representing. And two is often they dangle some things in front of you that are very helpful for your district. But oftentimes that thing they're dangling in front of you, you have to do something that hurts the entire city. And I feel like there's some more folks in there that understand that understand the power of sticking together and not taking the first, second thing that's dangling in front of you so you can say you did this for your district, when actually the thing that you have to do in exchange for that harms your district even more. And understanding, opening up the process to democracy, opening up the process, ceding power, whether it was what we did with participatory budgeting or trying to get people to be able to vote easier, or public financing, getting folks more involved is what we need. But it runs counter sometimes the way some of us electeds think, because it's mostly about incumbency protection. And I'm hoping that we have a group of folks now that really will push back on that model and make decisions that are best for the people of the city. Obviously, I can't act like I'm not in the game of politics, but you got to minimize that as much as humanly possible. So on the local level, continuing pushing for better public financing, expanding language access. We also want to make sure, as we're pushing the discussion of public safety, that people have the courage to really broaden that out. We spent a whole summer really focused on policing, understanding that police can never be equated to public safety. It's one part, but where's the rest of the parts? Is it being structured? Is it being financed? And too often it's not. And what I hope people will go back and look at what happened before the pandemic, that we had to fight tooth and nail for, but actually worked. And so I'm really excited about this council, because I think they get that. And the reason we've been able to have this diversity now is because of things like public financing, is because of things like term limits. And so those kind of things that allow folks like myself, who's a community organizer, didn't come through the normal ranks and doesn't have access to the type of money that other folks do, can really be beneficial to our city.
And I'm excited to see where I think we have an opportunity to have a body that thinks of politics as shifting power and not just political gamesmanship. And that, I think, is something that we're really excited to see as residents of the city of New York.
And of course, on other levels, you spoke about the local level, but things like ending the filibuster, things about making sure on the state level people can vote. We just lost 3 ballot initiatives, which is crazy and ridiculous. I don't want to get into too much of the politics, but there was tremendous failures there that would have gotten people to vote easier. The truth of the matter is, unless forced. Most electeds don't want to open up the process. We like to know exactly who we're talking to, and we don't want to deviate from that. We got these folks that are going to vote us in, but I think we have a group of folks, at least on the council level, that's going to push back on that. More and more, we're getting folks on the state level, and of course, I'm hoping we'll have some even more change on the state level soon.
Well, thank you so much, Jumaane and Keesha. I absolutely adore spending time with both of your brains. They're some of the finest in the city. So thank you for your time. I hope both of you get home safely, and that your families don't hate us too much for having you with us instead of with them this evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was an honor. Thank you so much.
John, I'm bringing you back onto the stage here.
John, what's up, John?
Thank you all. What's up? Thank you for this conversation. And I just want to close this out by saying the conversation and the call to action does not end here. We're really, as a part of the People's Tech Assemblies and as a part of the core mission of this office, the Public Advocate's Office, we're calling you to get engaged in the civic process. We need your narratives. We need your voice. We need your ideas to craft the solutions that are equitable and inclusive here in New York City. And you can do that now at People's Tech, People's plural, as Noel mentioned, peoplestech.nyc. Join the conversation. Let us know what you're experiencing. Let us know what you need in your community. And it's going to end up in the work that our office, BetaNYC, and our many partners are working on. So I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for the panel, and have a good night.